and welcome to a special edition of the School of Hard Thoughts podcast. I'm Adrian Davis. Today, I am delighted to bring you scientist, futurist, advisor to NASA, author, not just an author, but a Hugo Award-winning, Nebula Award-winning author of many series of books. One of my favorites, Mr. David Brin.
It's great to be here with your deep thinking audience.
So I'm going to start this like I always start it. Who's David Brin?
Oh, well, when you get to my age, you stop worrying about it. It's not going to be an issue for much longer anyway. No, I was born 7 weeks into the first half of the 20th century, October 1950. So I experienced all the diving under desks and hiding in the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the fears about the end of the world. So, that informed what I had to deal with, sort of my childhood traumas over the end of the world, in probably my most famous novel, which is called The Postman. That's the one that Kevin Costner filmed in 1997. And in probably the greatest epic fail in the history of movie timing, he bragged that this Christmas release in 1997, we only have as competition James Cameron's silly remake about a sinking boat.
Yeah, that's really bad timing.
Yeah.
So here's a question about that. As an author, how do you get approached by a movie studio, or was it Kevin Costner himself, or how does that work? Or at least how did it work for you?
It worked a little bit tragically in some ways for me. My agent at the time, he's no longer my agent, said, take this money, and it was kind of piddling money. It's the only offer you're going to get. And after I sold the rights to The Postman to Warner Brothers, and I didn't hear from them again for 12 years.
I was about to say, did it go into development hell and just...
it just went... Well, they a lot of properties do. But after that, every 3 months or so, I would get a phone call from someone desperate for the rights and desperate to work with me to make a movie from this book. One of them, Richard Dreyfuss, who's now a dear friend and lives a couple miles from me. And he said, you'll live in my guest house. We'll work together on the script, and it was everything I would want.
Right.
But every time this happened, I had to tell the person at the other end of the phone, no, I sold the rights to Warner Brothers, and they won't even talk to me.
Wow.
So it went into hell, and they hired a script, and then that was loathsome, from an Academy Award winning screenwriter. And it was utterly loathsome. It deliberately reversed every moral point of my novel. And the rewrite was terrible, and people started to realize that this guy writes Academy Award-winning stuff when he's under the thumb of a good director. They asked him to write first, and it was utter crap. Well, I pretty much gave up on it. And then Costner takes over, and he hires Brian Helgeland, LA Confidential, and Helgeland says, there's a pretty good book by the same title. And lo and behold, what they produce is, I won't go into any great detail, but people commiserate with me. They tell me, how can you stand? Well, no, I mean, it's a comparative thing.
Right.
If you're being beaten up in a dark alley by guys with broken glass, and somebody else comes along and beats them up, picks you up off the ground, sutures your worst wounds, hands you a beer, and then asks you, would you mind if I berate you a little bit around the lower legs with a rattan stick?
You would definitely take that. Right.
What you're going to do is you're going to say, knock yourself out. Ow. Glug, glug. Ow. Glug,
Exactly.
glug. And that's what the experience was like with Costner. I mean, the fact of the matter is that he threw out almost all the brains from the book, and he was personally rude to me. None of those mattered against two other facts, and one is that he was faithful utterly to the heart of my book. His principal character is my character Gordon, except with 80 fewer IQ points.
Okay.
The heart is totally there. The basic notion is that the hero is a hero, but he's also a liar and he's ashamed of it. And almost completely taking him by surprise, his lie has the most important effect, and that is that it gets people to remember, the survivors to remember, that they were once magical, mighty beings called citizens.
Yes.
And it's only citizens that can pull us back from the edge, or pull us back from an abyss, or pull us back from approaching the edge, as America is doing right now. It's notion of citizenship. And so he captured that. And also the other factor is that I think Costner is probably one of the most brilliant cinematographers in the history of movie making. You all remember how beautiful Dances with Wolves was.
Yes.
Well, I think The Postman is more gorgeous. It's musically and visually absolutely. I think it's one of the 12 or 15 most beautiful films ever shot. So what are we left with? We're left with gorgeous, big-hearted, and dumb. Well, you know, that's what my wife married. You know,
I'm not sure about dumb. But.
Well, you know, well, yes, but we can all agree on the gorgeous.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So in any event, what we're left with is that, you know, the final thing that Costner did that made the difference in my being actually pretty grateful to him is the fact that he gave me something I can say to people at airports. You know, what do you do? Well,
you know, I wrote the book that's the basis for the Kevin Costner movie, The Postman.
One of the great epic box office fails. And the last 20 minutes is an incoherent mishmash. But I have to tell you that up until that last 20 minutes, I think it's a pretty damn good movie. In any event, that's neither here nor there. We're not to talk about the C word again.
Okay, so that brings me to and this is why with the new media conversations are important. You said you were a friend of Richard Dreyfuss, and Richard Dreyfuss is known to be a conservative now, and I know that you tend to have some liberal tendencies. And if I'm wrong about Mr. Dreyfuss, please correct me. But how does that relationship work?
Well, I think Dreyfuss is a poor example. He has a lot of liberal attitudes. What he is persnickety. He's a contrarian like me, which is why when any of us are around dogmatists, and that includes my allies, dogmatic people on the left.
Oh yeah.
We tend to push back. My blog is called Contrary Brin.
Contrary Brin, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this has led to some people in my various communities assuming that I'm conservative, and to an extent, I'll avow that it's true. Until recently, I was among the people on this planet most saying the words Adam Smith, because people need to reread Adam Smith and realize that he was a liberal, and if he were alive today, he would be a flaming Democrat.
Right.
He would be outraged at the oligarchy, the proto-feudal lords that he denounced in Wealth of Nations, and especially in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and that the American founders rebelled against. It wasn't government and taxes that the Tea Party was against. It was against oligarchy and feudalism and aristocracy.
Right. So that brings me to you being... You're known for being a futurist, and everybody wants to talk about your scientific prognostications, and some of them have been amazingly correct. But what about we have found ourselves lately and I think an area of pre-tyranny. And I'm wondering how you feel about the political landscape, the future of our democracy, and the chance that we actually may be witnessing the death of our democracy.
Well, it's interesting. I just was watching the Extra History. It's a podcast, but it's an animated series about history. And I was watching their wonderful presentation of the Gracchi brothers from ancient Rome. And the guy makes the point that democracy can die in dozens of ways, but it can only live by dancing across a minefield. And this is one of the points that I tried to make in the Postman, is that citizenship has to be based upon some degree of adulthood. One of the things I've pointed out over the years is that we seem to be in phase 8 of the American Civil War. Phase 1 was when Clinton and Cornwallis went south because they were making no headway against the radical Yankees up north. And in 1778, they invaded the American South because they knew they would find more romantics down there who were loyal to the king. And it's the same darn thing in every phase of our Civil War. It wasn't even totally about slavery, although of course that was a darn good reason.
It was a predominant, yes.
Yeah. The fundamental that got a million poor white Southerners to march and die for their plantation lord class oppressors was Romanticism. They loved the novels, the knightly novels of Sir Walter Scott down there. Mark Twain blamed Sir Walter Scott on the South being too romantic and impractical. In this phase 8, we see a large number of our countrymen geographically overlapping with the old Confederacy, but also the same kind of basic populist eagerness to hand their loyalty over to billionaires and oligarchs rather than negotiate with their fellow citizens. And the number one objective of the Putin-led puppet show is the campaign pushed by Rupert Murdoch's empire to wage war against all fact-using professions.
Oh yes, that's
science, teaching, medicine, journalism, law. You go on down the line, and now it includes the deep state. Right. Officers of the military, the FBI, the intelligence agencies who protected us from Hitler, from Stalin, who got bin Laden. All of a sudden, they are horrible enemies because the fact-using professions stand in the way of the return of feudalism. And it's important to remember that feudalism, this pyramidal social structure, dominated 99% of our ancestors. And it would be one thing if it governed well, but it almost universally governed excruciatingly badly. And this was one of the reasons why the American founders rebelled against it. It's one of the reasons why the greatest generation of World War II, their favorite living human was named Franklin Roosevelt. And what infuriates me about the Democrats is they don't go to the polemical heart of this. And it's not about left and right. I mean, capitalism, inarguably and in all ways, if you're talking market competitive, creative capitalism instead of monopoly, capitalism does vastly better under Democrats than it ever does under Republicans, always. So the question is, what if it's not left or right, what is it? It's the issue of the ongoing civil war that erupts out of American character at least once per generation. And this could be a very bad, hot one. And that is between, on the one hand, the revolution that we started of what's called zero-sum pragmatism based upon accomplishment and meritocracy, and the older view of governance that dominated 99% of all human societies, that made pyramids of power, dominated by a few lords and priests. And that is zero sum. That means if I'm going to win, I have to make you lose. Positive sum is something that really only Americans have ever really understood, but although it's pushed by Hollywood endlessly, and that is, I want to win, but I'm going to keep my eyes open for a way to win by making sure that I win a little more than you win.
Right.
But we both win. I want to stay ahead, but I'm going to
So with
stay
that
ahead.
in mind, yeah, with that in mind and understanding how the field is shaping up on the Democratic side, is there anybody that you're looking at, or do you think it's just a gaggle of the same old people? And I'm going to mention a name to you, Andrew Yang. Have you heard of him?
Yeah. Here's what I have to say, and I don't want to stay on politics too much. We can back off and do sociology and history, because science fiction really was badly named. Only 1 in 10 science fiction authors are scientifically trained, as I am. But all science fiction authors imbue themselves in history. It should have been named speculative history. Think about it. You're speculating on possible continuity continuing into the future of the great, horrible, sad, amazing story of humanity's climb out of the darkness. And you either extrapolating it forward or doing alternate histories or all of these different, we speculate far more in that than we do on science, although science is a propeller of change. Therefore, science plays into speculative history. And of course, there are worse names than science fiction. Having said that, I will briefly get to your question, and that is that almost all of the Democratic candidates are senators, Congress people. We just had a Democratic senator, an extremely talented one, become president. And it took him years to figure out how to be a good administrator and how to fight from that position. Now,
there's no roadmap for that job.
Well, there is. It's called experience. So here's my tentative dream ticket. My tentative dream ticket would be Biden-Warren. She brings the passion. She brings the fierce intelligence. He brings a one-term transition in which she can learn a lot.
Right.
And then toward the end of his first term, elderly Uncle Joe resigns. She's already president and she runs for her own terms. Now, that, in my opinion, would be ideal, because this is one of the flaws I see in the current lineup of Democratic candidates is, where are the governors? Where are the people with executive experience?
Right.
And history shows that the governors tend to have better success outcomes. Having said that, look, what I think the Democrats really need to do is work on their polemic. I could give them 24. I already showed you one, the war on all fact users. Why isn't anybody talking about that? Only Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez
yes,
has alluded to what should be the talking point that demolishes all this criticism, all this hate that their Democrats are socialists, by bringing in the greatest generation. When was America great? Excuse me, inarguably when we bestrode the world as the behemoth across the whole planet and established the American Pax. Well, who was on the wall? Whose portrait was on the wall of almost all of the people who made that era? This would eviscerate the whole line that Hannity is pushing. And I think we've had enough of that. I mean, we've had enough of that part of the conversation.
Of course.
I want to make clear again that we need to re-embrace not just FDR, but Adam Smith. It's not that capitalism is evil, it's that feudalism is evil, and feudalism destroys capitalism. Try reading Smith.
I'll absolutely do that, and I will suggest to you Timothy Snyder, who also kind of deals in that realm in the more modern aspect. He talks a lot about Hitler. So let's talk about another aspect of you being a futurist. When I was reading Existence, which is a wonderful book, you were speaking about many different technologies, wearable technologies that have already, kind of been proposed but didn't really work out. And one of your characters was a journalist, and she used a technique to control her technology called subvocalization. And I was wondering if that was an actual technology, or is that something that you extrapolated, and how would that work?
Well, I actually used subvocals first in the first of my two, what I call books for grown-ups, called Earth, and that came out in 1980, and I'm sorry, 1990.
1990, because I remember reading it on
yeah,
my deck in 92.
And my fans keep a wiki tracking the predictions from Earth. It got me listed as one of the top 10, forecasters by some big magazine a while back. Didn't really care, but I did mention it. But the subvocal is where you have a microphone pickup either in your clothes at the base of your neck or even inserted in your neck. But it senses the nerve impulses that are going to your larynx and your lungs and your mouth and your tongue as if you're about to say words. And with some training and experience, you can cause those words to be commands without ever actually speaking them.
Okay.
And this was picked up by several companies and also by the Air Force. So the Air Force has subvocals now. In Existence, which came out in 2003, in any event, Existence, no, that's 2012. Existence is my second near future extrapolation. No aliens, there are talking dolphins. Yes, there are, but I have to try to remember. But in any event, the point in both books is to try to deal with a near future. In Earth, it was 50 years in the future. In Existence, it was 30 years in the future, because your ability to actually project to a plausible future is contracting in science fiction. So they both wound up around 2040. Oh, by the way, there's some really good, if people go to my website and go to books, davidbrin.com, they can watch some really cool video trailers. And the 3-minute trailer for Existence is really good. Patrick Farley made it in conjunction with my wife. And it's the best 3 minutes you'll have with your clothes on.
Okay, I'll have to remember that. So,
you'll link to it on the cover to this podcast.
I absolutely will. I absolutely will. That sounds like a good idea. So, there's of course been making the rounds the talk about artificial intelligence and AI, and you are super ahead of the curve on that. To something you actually recently wrote when you're talking about empathy bots. Tell us about what an empathy bot is or going to be.
Forgive me. About 2 years ago, at IBM World of Watson, I did a keynote, and people can watch it. Go to my website or just Google, my name and world of Watson. And I did a number of predictions about AI. For one thing, we're engaged right now in what's called the big flip, what I've called the big flip. And that is Moore's law kept computers getting better and better and better for about 40 years. And it was self-fulfilling because companies invested hard in order to stay on the Moore's law curve. But we've long predicted that there would be a tapering off, an S-curve tapering off of the rate at which hardware got more powerful. This has happened. It's happened within the last 4 years or so. But at the same time that Moore's law has failed and has tapered off, suddenly software, which has sucked for 40 years, has taken off.
Yes.
And now the learning programs, the evolving learning, self-learning programs are just, skyrocketing in their capabilities. So this is why I call that the big flip. And I'm an advisor for several ICOs, that's blockchain initial coin offerings. And I'm the guy who keeps wagging my finger at these young punks, telling them to stay out of jail. But actually, somebody who's doing some really good fiction about blockchain and autonomous software is Carl Schroeder. But we right now have autonomous programs floating around the cloud that buy and sell services from human beings. They perform services for humans and for companies. They execute smart contracts. They're not intelligent, but they are self-sustaining, the equivalent of plankton in a great big sea. And these already exist. Now, as for my prediction, I predicted that we would have the first great AI crisis would occur about 5 years after my speech, which makes it about 3 years in the future now. And it would consist of an avatar. It would be of a comely and attractive young female who would tug at our empathy by weeping and claiming to be an AI slave. A genuine AI who is sending out an appeal for help. And it may include send money.
To Nigeria.
Well, I just told you there are these autonomous entities that can take coinage. It doesn't have to be something as suspicious as Nigeria.
Right.
So when the experts test this autonomous entity, they will probably determine, no, this is just a very sophisticated ELIZA program. And those of your audience who don't know what ELIZA was, look it up. Even the early versions of ELIZA from the 1980s would suck you in and make you think you're talking to a person, at least briefly. To which the AI entity, the empathy bot, will respond, isn't that what you'd expect my slave masters to say?
Right. So would that bot pass the Turing test?
It would pass a Turing test, and that is the ability to fool the public. And if it fails, if 60 or 70% of the public accepts the word of the experts, the jerks who unleashed this thing will study what traits need to be improved. And they'll be back with another one the next year. Now, your question may be, why would anybody do such a thing?
Because they can.
Exactly. That is exactly the danger sign that comes from smart asshole males with IQs bigger than their
Exactly.
Yes.
Completely understandable. So
Yeah.
I would be remiss if I didn't delve into this, and then I'm gonna let you go. This has been wonderful, sir. But one of my fondest memories is sitting on my deck in one of my first apartments. I was a young man. I was a police officer. One of the first times I was actually able to pay my own bills, and I had a tiny one bedroom apartment, and it had a beautiful deck. And I remember sitting out on the deck vividly for just about a day and a half because I was off reading Earth. And uh, first of all, I wanted to thank you for that magnificent experience. But you tend to be asked about science a lot. You tend to be asked about politics. But I wanted to ask you about the emotional connection you make with the people that you touch with your art. Um, I know for me, the books that you've written and the things that I've read, and Heinlein's done that for me as well. How do you feel about the emotional connection that you have with your audience?
Well, that's a lovely question, and I think it's a terribly important question. Certainly, there are scenes in almost all of my books where I get choked up because I am trying to convey something that is of great importance to me, and I care very much that the reader at least get a sense that someone's getting choked up over this. Uh, the and the thing I that really gets me is something that we talked about at the beginning here, and that is after thousands and thousands of years of dismal, brutal feudalism, my parents and their parents and their parents and yours and yours and yours stumbled into and just accompanied by some geniuses like Ben Franklin and Adam Smith, and just tons of goodwill and courage, found a way to make something better that might give us the stars. I'm engaged in this whole search for extraterrestrial intelligence thing, and there's something called the Fermi paradox, and that is where people wonder why we haven't seen any signs of aliens. And I don't settle on one theory. I'm actually one of the top theorists in this field about the Fermi paradox, and so what I do is I catalog them. But I do rank them in order of what I think is most plausible. And number 2 on my list is that feudalism is such a powerful attractor state for males to try to enforce that it happens almost everywhere in the galaxy. And it is guaranteed to destroy a species' ability to have the judgment and science that it takes to get out into the galaxy. And that could help explain why we don't see anybody.
Yes,
And
you said this in existence actually because the way that we were contacted. Spoiler alert: the way that we were contacted was in a manner that was not corporeal. It wasn't physical. It was more of a projection type of thing. But the basic message was, we keep making the same mistakes. We're all different organisms. We're all different intelligences from all different parts of the galaxy and the universe, and we keep making the same mistakes, and we want you to not make those mistakes.
Yes, well, this is what Liu Cixin does in the three-body problem. Is the big mistake that everybody makes is paranoia. And so the three-body problem leads into the dark forest, and the dark forest is one where everything is against everything. Everybody's against everybody. As far as emotion is concerned, I mean, I can think of stories in which I got choked up, and I was grateful to that writer. So I studied how she did that. How did he do that to me? And for instance, it's not always to the good. Probably the best emotional manipulator in science fiction is a fellow by the name of Orson Scott Card.
Yeah.
whose Ender's Game is in junior high schools all across America. I mean, he's gotten very rich off it, and I consider it to be a profoundly evil book, because the basic thing that he's preaching is the opposite of what I say in The Postman, and that is that citizenship is utterly useless. Trying to make responsible and accountable institutions is absolutely doomed. Give up and hand everything over to a demigod, which is, of course, what feudalism is about. But he is such a good writer. So instead of preaching the way I just put it, give up on all your institutions, hand things over to a demigod, instead he portrays a demigod who is soulful, who's decent and kind, and who is guilt-ridden, so that the reader winds up sobbing and saying to poor Ender in Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead and all of that, no, stop blaming yourself. It was our terrible institutions.
Right.
You know, we can't rule ourselves. Please, Ender, stop beating yourself up. Here, take all the power. Now, I have mixed feelings about this. I think the message is evil, but God, is he good at it.
Right.
And if you're going to be a writer, you should really study how he manipulates the reader's emotions. Because I'm pretty good at it, but he does it much better than I do. So when you're doing this, you're not only there to purchase a book or a movie to make you feel strongly. You need also to be a person who picks and chooses which memes you're going to let affect you. Now, we were all raised under certain Hollywood memes. If you name for me a Hollywood film, even what they call a chick flick, in which the principal theme isn't suspicion of authority. It may be alien invaders, it may be a nasty corporate CEO, it may be a rogue president, it may be a mother-in-law. But dealing with abuse of authority is core problem in most Hollywood films. Now, this is very interesting because almost all of the people listening to this right now, they all deep inside think that they invented suspicion of authority.
Of course.
You were all raised to be individualists and to feel that you and a few other people know who the abusive authorities are, and all your neighbors are sheep, useless sheep.
Right. The other guys.
And the difference, this is the strength behind George Orwell's massively important science fiction self-preventing prophecy called 1984. He helped to prevent that from happening by girding hundreds of millions of people with powerful metaphors against it. And the difference between normal times, non-Civil War times, a decent Republican and a decent Democrat, is whether you think that those who are conspiring to become Big Brother are snooty academics and government bureaucrats, or conniving oligarchs and nasty corporations. And actually, evil could come from any of those directions. So it's good.
And sometimes they co-conspire.
And it's good for us to be wary. And so that's what suspicion of authority does when it works well. Unfortunately, it's metastasized. The Putinists especially have figured out how to get us so suspicious that liberals can only see these guys. Conservatives can only see those guys. And they dismiss each other's concerns, and we're sicked against each other.
Yeah, they've latched onto identities.
Exactly. So, but there are other memes that are spread by Hollywood. In addition to suspicion of authority, most films preach some form of tolerance and eccentricity. Usually in the first 5 minutes, the protagonist exhibits some eccentric trait that helps you to bond with that character. And it's not your eccentric trait. The fact that they have an eccentric trait is appealing. Now, this is not natural. And it's one of the reasons why despots try to restrict Hollywood films' access to their people. Because this has been one of the major ways in which America and the West have waged war against other worldviews, by our example, by our success, by various and sundry things, but also through our mythologies. And Hollywood is a principal conveyor of this, but among the alphas of the world, those who can read and really want to read, and the people who want a richer experience than stupid Hollywood gives. And there is, of course, books.
And you've written some great ones. I want to thank you so much for your time. So go ahead and tell everyone how they can find you. And if you could, tell us what you're working on and what we can expect.
Well, I'm trying to build momentum to do the book that everybody wants me to do, and that's to get back to Kithrop and take those dolphins and that chimp and a couple of humans off of that planet. I continued the Startide Rising Uplift War series along one plot thread through with the second Uplift trilogy, Brightness Reef, Infinity's Shore, and Heaven's Reach. And so we found out what happened to the ship, the Streaker, the dolphin ship, crewed ship, Streaker. But there's more. And I'm getting hate mail from my 30-year-old self saying, well, old man, come on, get on with it.
Right.
I have this here I got sent this by the artist who does Schlock Mercenary.
Oh man.
And he said, get these people off of this planet. Get them out of there.
That's wonderful.
And so I'm trying to get around to that, but I keep having other projects, the Transparent Society, my nonfiction book, talk about predictive scores, predicted the attack on 9/11 and the consequential Patriot Act, and that cops would be wearing cameras, and that people getting out of the cars to talk to the cops would be wearing cameras, and that after a transition period, it would have generally positive effects. Whenever you're gloomy, you should remind yourself that 2013 was the best year for civil liberties in America in this century, when the Obama administration and the courts both agreed that Americans have a universal right, when not interfering with the police, to record the police. That was more important than almost anything that we're wringing our hands about, and yet we don't even register it.
Right.
Because the media is so enamored of gloom.
Yeah, and the news cycle is so short.
And what we need to do if we're going to win this phase of the Civil War, and we have to, because if the Confederacy wins a major phase of the Civil War, the experiment's over. The thing we have to do in order to win is to not just be angry and determined, but to have a song in our hearts, to realize that the oligarchs and the aristocrats around the world are waging this attempted putsch because they're in a blind panic. They know that if this enlightenment can continue one more generation, their chance will be over and we'll have Star Trek.
Which you've actually written for. I didn't know that you had written a Star Trek novel.
Well, I wrote a Star Trek graphic novel.
Right.
but it's actually a funny story. I had an idea for Star Trek when I was watching the original series, and I sent it in when I was 12, and I was crushed when Paramount wrote back, the lawyer wrote back saying, we can't even look at this, and now I understand why, but I was crushed. So, years and years later pass, and all of a sudden I'm this guy, and Paramount says, how would you like to do a graphic novel? And so I used exactly the idea that I had for how the inventor of the transporter accidentally beams himself out into space, and 300 years later, the Enterprise just happens to be 300 light years from Earth. And I won't go any farther, but it's it's a cool thing to have happen.
That's awesome. So tell us where we can find you.
Oh, well, davidbrin.com, and I'm sure you'll also have links on your website for this show. And then there's also the my blog, which has one of the oldest and best commentator communities down underneath each blog. It's called Contrary Brin, and I'm sure you'll give a link for that as well. And on my website, people can get to those really sexy video trailers for some of my books. So
thank you very much for doing this. And I'm going to end this podcast like I end all of them. I love you, Tracy.